The Power of Silence by Horatio Dresser, 1904. Chapter 1, The Point of View. Now that the 19th century has ended and scholars are making their estimates of its many tendencies, it is becoming more and more clear that it is to be known as the century of the philosophy of evolution. It has been an eminently practical era, the age of mechanical invention and discovery, and toward its close, an epoch of sociological inquiry. But the philosophy of evolution came first, and the unprecedented inquiry into causes, sources, origins prepared the way for the profound interests which marked the transition to the present century. It is today a truism to declare that no event or person can be understood apart from environment and from evolutionary history. Sometimes the inroads of science have seemed to threaten the foundations of man's most sacred faith. But in the end, the essentials of faith have been marvelously enriched. The widespread inquiry into customs, traditions, races, and religions has tended toward the unification of all our thinking about mankind. Hence, many distinctions between creeds and doctrines have faded out in the light of the larger sympathy and sense of brotherhood which the inquiry has inspired. A new spirit of tolerance has brought a willingness to admit that despite all differences in creed and dogma, men are really in earnest striving for the same great ends the world over. The important consideration is to know how far a man has advanced in moral and religious evolution, what manner of life he lives. This new demand that man shall understand himself in the light of all the causes that have operated to produce him has still more significance when we turn from the outer world to the inner. Thus far, evolutionary science has dealt with man in large part as a physical being. There was a time, in fact, during the middle of the 19th century, when the entire inquiry seemed to make for materialism. Closer scrutiny of the results showed, however, that the ultimate problems of life, the questions concerning the real nature of existence, the character of the real man, and the like, were left for idealistic philosophy to solve. We now know that to maintain the evolutionary point of view is by no means to be materialistic. At any rate, evolutionary materialism is a failure. There are decided limits beyond which mere evolutionism has been unable to go. It's difficult also for natural science to advance into the inner world, for science deals with the universal, and the inner life is in a peculiar sense the home of the individual. Even experimental psychology fails in the attempt to discover the true character of the inner life. The most interesting questions are still unanswered when psychology has completed its description of our states of consciousness. In fact, psychology as a natural science explicitly disclaims the right to ascertain the values of inner experience or discover the nature of the self. It is necessary, if the search for origins is to be complete, for each man to take up the work where science leaves it, and pursue the investigation by the same fruitful method of systematic research. There are plenty of skeptics to raise objections to any such procedure. It will be said that the era of morbid self-examination and conscientiousness will again return. Others will insist that the inner life is a mystery past finding out. To all this, the reply is that man already lives in and knows much about the inner life. This is no new venture. It's only a question of substituting more knowledge for less knowledge. It's the halfway positions of imprisoning self-consciousness that distress us. There's no inherent danger in analytical self-knowledge or rational synthesis. The essential is that such analysis and synthesis shall be thorough. Ordinarily, self-knowledge stops short of the most important consideration. If we are to be thorough, we must ask, what is man's ultimate origin? What is his real environment? Whither is he tending? These are profound philosophical questions, to be sure, but there are respects in which they are also problems for experimental investigation. No man is more truly a child of this practical age than the one who approaches these issues in the spirit of empirical research. Individual man now has far more material to draw upon in his effort to investigate the inner life in a free, profitable spirit. Whatever one may think of the conclusions which bear upon the belief in a future life, it is clear that the finer aspects of psychic research have thrown light upon the mysteries of the inner world. Meanwhile, a new science has been springing up midway between experimental psychology and the realm of the individual soul, namely the psychology of religion, and a new literature of the soul has also begun to appear. It remains for the individual to seize upon the results of all this finer, more exact thinking and verify or correct them in the light of personal problems. The farther science advances into the inner world, the easier it will be to avoid imprisoning subjectivism. The essential is to approach the study in the right temper. In a sense, the inner life is a gift which all men share. Its universal characteristics each man may verify. What makes it real is the fact that each of us just now possesses it. First of all, it is owned and observed as experience. It pulsates, presents new moments, even while we observe it. Every man is in possession of clues, which will reveal the deeper meanings of this surging stream. For every man has perplexities which have been postponed and postponed, not because they're insoluble, but simply because these difficulties have not been met in precisely the situation where they arose. It is essential, then, that at each point in the discussion the reader pause to make the thought his own through quiet realization of its spirit and its meaning. Let him pause to ask, what does this mean for me? How does it explain? How does it accord or conflict with my experience? Have I ever devoted time and reflection alone with my deeper self to realize the full bearing of the profoundest and sublimest truths of life? Have I ever made them my own and actualized them in daily life? Or is there still a chasm between theory and practice? If the reader will keep this practical object constantly in view, unsuspected applications of well-known truths will become apparent before he finishes the volume. If one is to pass beyond mere self-analysis of the usual sort, it is clear, however, that one must be willing to entertain the thought of a fundamental system of realities. To end in a large world, one must begin with broad premises. If man's life is environed by a larger life, he cannot understand himself alone. In deepest truth, there is no alone. Our own experimental observation proves that, first of all, it seems impossible even to outline one's method of investigation without admitting that the presence of an environing life is the most striking consideration. What that life shall be called is, of course, another question, but for oneself, the frank admission must be made at the outset that it is the presence of the Divine Father, without whom the most elementary fact seems unintelligible. If the reader names it otherwise, well and good. It's not now a question of names. As a possible aid to inquiry, the present discussion is confessedly a chapter from life, an appeal to life. The aim is to convey the living reality itself, so far as possible, instead of merely talking about it. Hence, the appeal is to the profoundest experience of the reader, recognized, confessed as what it most generally reveals itself to be. The appeal is to reason too, but reason must start with facts, with actual life. It does not create its own objects. How else can one hope to unite philosophy and life than by this frank union of experience and thought, one's deepest life made explicit? It is obviously wiser to be true to all aspects of life as it appears from the angle of one's own temperament and experience than to force all facts into a certain system. The deepest facts are usually slighted, if not excluded, by the latter process. No formula seems large enough to cover all we know and feel. There is an element in experience that usually eludes description. Some experiences can never be told. They are intimately a part of us. They are sacred, and one hesitates to speak of them. Yet, one can suggest them, or at least let it be known that in these rarest moments of existence, one seemed mostly truly to live. Only in this way does a soul that part of us which is most truly individual, find expression. Only in this way does the unfettered soul show its freedom from prejudice and dogma. Allegiance to a person or theory limits one to the particular view of life represented by that person or theory. To claim finality for one's system would be equivalent to affirming that progress shall end with the particular discussion in question. Our theories serve us well while we remember that life itself is larger. Life then is large, let us say once for all, and demands a broad way of thinking about it. Ordinarily, we have no sense of what our total self means. We suffer and we seek relief. We are absorbed in the present, in its needs and woes, unaware that our whole past lives, our inheritance, and our temperament may affect this bit of suffering nature, which for the moment limits our thought. We live as though time were soon to cease, and prudence would not permit us an hour for quiet reflection. Yet a new phase, and to some the happiest phase of life, begins when they stop hurried thought and try quietly to realize what life means as an advancing whole. If life is in some sense one system, can any other interpretation be rational? Will the parts ever assume their true relationship in our minds except when viewed in the light of the whole? Possibly our suffering is largely unnecessary. Possibly it has come about because we failed to adjust our thought to the wholeness of things. At any rate, to take time at last to isolate one's self from the rushing tide of daily life and to raise the great questions here proposed is to begin in earnest to experiment. From the first, one stands in need of all sorts of conclusions which seem to belong rather to the end. It's one thing to talk about the power of silence and another to be able to pause long enough to enjoy it. One is eager to know what that power is, yet one must first have a basis to stand upon. The fact that a relatively obscure element besets all our thinking about the inner life is no excuse for vagueness. To fall back upon feeling or faith alone will no longer suffice. We are in quest of the whole, and reason is surely a part of life's whole. There is both the hurrying flux of our tantalizing consciousness, the part of life which refuses to be still, and there is the persistent conviction that life has a deeper reality, which it is the office of calmer thinking to discover. Clearly, we must take life as we find it and move forward, faithful alike to feeling and to thought. One fact, however, is clear. Experience is best explained at the outset by reference to its environment. If the problem seems too large for us at first, it would surely prove more difficult if we try to leap beyond present experience. It's only a question of attaining closer and closer acquaintance with the near at hand. If our logic at last compels us to look beyond immediate experience in search of its basis, then that basis must be such as actual life demands. The truth is involved in the very nature of the beings and things by which we are surrounded. It only needs to be evolved or made explicit. All power is immanent. It works through something. Man should not look beyond his own nature, his temperament, inheritance, education, until he is compelled to do so in order to find an adequate explanation of his experience. He should have a clear conception of the closely related events out of which his life has proceeded, as the river is enlarged and shaped in its course by its tributaries, and the country through which it flows, yet never rises higher than its source. In a word, he must know his origin, both immediate and remote. He must start with personal experience, but should not stop until he's traced it to the source beyond which thought cannot go. The point of view of this book, then, is explicitly empirical. By the term empirical, as here used, is meant that our existence in the universe is made known through experience, and that by studying experience, testing our theories by further experience, and keeping close to the assured results, we may not only solve our practical problems, but gain knowledge of life as a whole. That is to say, experience brings changes. We reflect upon those changes and experiment. By experiment, we learn what theories are sound and practical and what are absurd. The purpose of our theories is to explain experience, and further experience, rationally tested, shows whether or not we have succeeded. Each of us possesses experience, and each man may experiment for himself. Experience means much or little according to the degree of individual experiment. To gain more knowledge of the sort that is really worthwhile, a man must put more theories to the test, observe more acutely, think more seriously. It may well be that experience as individually made known to us is unable fully to account for itself. Something more than mere description is called for. The question, what is the nature of experience, leads directly to idealistic analysis and ultimately to some sort of constructive idealism, that is, a systematic restatement of the data of experience in terms of reason. But we are not here concerned with the ultimate unification of the data of experience, nor are we concerned with the more theoretical evidences for idealism. To be sure, we must introduce certain arguments, for example, a plea for the immanence of God, but the chief value of these arguments will be found in their practical empirical bearings. That is, the argument for the divine immanence or for the idealistic interpretation of experience will serve as a central line of thought by the pursuit of which the reader may follow the developments of his own experience. In other words, it's the value or meaning which the reader attributes to the argument that is of consequence. The first-hand evidence is of more import than the theoretical description. But once in fuller possession of the empirical evidence, one is in a position to follow the philosophical implications much further than the present arguments carry them. Three important distinctions are involved in this brief outline. One, first, there is the question of fact. For example, there is experience of a religious type, an emotional uplift or sense of worship. Two, there is a particular theory brought forward to account for the fact. If you are a pantheist, you'll conclude that in the ineffable religious moment you are identical with the absolute. But if you are a theist, you'll revere God as the Father and indulge in no mystical theories of identification. 3. Furthermore, there are the practical values which you attach to the facts. If you conclude that God is the Father, your conduct will differ greatly from that of the mystic. In the end, it's undoubtedly the values which we attribute to experience that influence us most. For values are ideals, and we develop by means of ideals. Ordinarily, it's only the technical philosopher who distinguishes thus sharply between facts, theories, and values, but the distinction is plainly of great importance. Very few people know what a fact is. The majority read their opinions into the given matters of experience and mistake what they want to believe for what is so. But one can make little headway in the endeavor to understand experience without constant discrimination between fact and theory. And there is clearly a great difference between that which is and that which may be or ought to be. The present inquiry will be chiefly based on these distinctions. The reader is already in possession of facts, that is, of experience. He also possesses abundant theories. Modern science describes for him the physical world in which he lives. History narrates man's life in the past. Moral science sets forth the views of men in regard to what ought to be. Christianity is an inculcation of religious principles. Philosophy is the intelligent coordination of all theories. But there is need of an art of life, which shall show man how to live philosophically. This, the most practical of arts, each man may contribute to by giving thought to the problems and laws of his own experience. What he most needs is a working ideal, a principle by which to apply philosophy more successfully. Hence the importance of ideals, the realizational aspect of religious teaching, the practical worth of philosophical thinking, hence too the value of silence, of sufficient repose to enable a man to realize the meaning, the spirit of what he believes. For this inquiry, the reader needs no other equipment than he already possesses. Each of us is feeling, acting, living amidst the great stream of events which we call experience. Yonder are the fields and the hills. Above is the fair blue sky. Near at hand are the houses of friends and neighbors, theaters of fascinating interests. Within the mind there are passing thoughts and varying emotions. Implied in all these transient mental states are the habits by which we have developed and the convictions which underlie our conduct. The essential is to awaken to consciousness of this surging play of circumstance, discover how we are taking it, and consider how we may become more wisely adjusted. This is to enter more fully into the spirit of the age, to become philosophers of evolution in a yet profounder sense. For it shows not only how experience leads to experience, but even how thought follows thought. Thus, we may enter into the fullness of life as it passes, and by this profounder mastery win the greater repose. And he who can break away from the age sufficiently to meditate upon it in peace is indeed ready to apprehend its finest values, to live in it, yet not of it.